He's just coughing up a storm. Okay, so this is Lee and Grant. We're the Adversaries documentary. This is from the People Profiles. Now, it's two different documentaries. There's one about Lee and one about Grant, and they made this one where they combined them. And I'm going to guess they combined them in a way where a little bit about Lee, a little bit about Grant. It goes back and forth, I'm guessing. And so it's pretty much the same amount of time. So I'm going to break this down into 14-minute videos. It's going to be a lot, but that's okay. Yeah, 14-minute videos. And we're going to start right now.
The man known to history as Robert Edward Lee was born on the 19th of January 1807 in Stratford Hall, Virginia. His father was Henry Lee III, who was born into a privileged family and was also a famous American Revolutionary War hero. Henry Lee grew up in one of the foremost families in Virginia, as his mother, Lucy Grimes, was once courted by George Washington, while his father, Henry Lee II, bred horses. When Henry...
I believe Henry Lee was, during the Revolutionary War, was nicknamed Light Horse Harry Lee. And he did not have a good ending to his life.
the third turned 14, he attended Princeton, with other founding fathers like Aaron Burr and James Madison standing out amongst his peers. It was during this time that Henry Lee became wrapped up in revolutionary sentiment and joined the Continental Army. He climbed through the ranks and earned the nickname Light Horse Harry, following the cavalry charge he led at the Battle of Paulus Hook, New Jersey, which drew the attention of George Washington. Following the war, he served as the governor of Virginia. Robert E. Lee's mother was Anne Hill Carter, who was born into a prestigious and wealthy plantation family. Anne's father, Charles Carter, was a fifth-generation plantation owner of the Shirley Plantation. Anne Carter married Henry Lee III during his governorship on the 18th of June 1793 in the governor's mansion parlor room. Following his retirement from the governorship, Anne moved in with Henry Lee at the family's holdings. Together, the couple had a total of 6 children, but only 5 survived into adulthood, with Robert E. Lee being the 5th child born. When Robert E. Lee was only 1, the family fell on hard times, as the main source of income, the Stratford Plantation, was taken via entail and given to Henry's son from his first marriage, Henry Lee IV. The lost revenue was just one financial disaster that fell upon the family, as Henry Lee had terrible luck in land
Sorry, I hit the wrong button.
And ended up in debtor's jail twice. While protecting one of his friends who opposed the War of 1812, Henry Lee was injured severely and left the family to recover. Robert E. Lee would not see his father again.
Okay, I know this isn't about him. He was defending a newspaper in Maryland, who was writing things about like the government or whatever, and so he stepped in to protect him because a mob was showing up. I think they were defending the government in the War of 1812, I think, and a mob showed up, and he told the mob, freedom of press, freedom, you gotta leave. And they attacked, and they beat him, I believe, to a paraplegic, and which is bad enough, but then they poured hot wax into his eyes. So he just kind of glossed over that, but yeah, it was brutal. It was brutal.
As he died on the 25th of March, 1818, on Cumberland Island, Georgia, was trying to reunite with his family. Ultimately, Robert's father became known simply as the man who wrote Washington a bad check. Lee spent his time with his widowed mother in a modest home, though this was only possible due to the Carters leaving a small legacy to sustain her. The family lived at the Ravensworth plantation, which was owned by one of Anne's relatives, William Henry Fitzhugh. Ravensworth plantation would serve as the backdrop for Lee's depressing childhood, as the house was on the outskirts of Alexandria, in the swampy, mosquito-infested and unhealthy part of town. The house's interior was never painted while the Lees resided there, and they did not live alone, as they frequently shared with boarders. Lee did not live a privileged childhood, but he had fond memories of his pet lobster and hummingbird, which began his love of animals, yet they sadly both passed on the same day. Lee spent his summers swimming in the Potomac and playing in the local springs. He attended a plantation school in Fauquier County before attending the Alexandria Academy at the age of 14. He received an excellent education whilst attending the Alexandria Academy, learning literature, algebra, as well as the classics. Lee's family was well connected to the Virginia aristocracy. This led to Fitzhugh penning a letter to United States Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, imploring that he allow Lee a spot at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Fitzhugh had Lee deliver the letter personally to Calhoun, which resulted in Lee being enrolled at West Point in 1825. For all of Lee's life, he had lived in the world of slavery, and now that he would be attending West Point, he would be entering a world where slavery was all but extinct. But despite the Lees' financial situation, they maintained 4 slaves left to Anne by her father. Lee was accustomed to being surrounded by slaves, but as he went further north, the number of enslaved blacks lessened, and whilst they were still not equal, many held freedoms Lee was not accustomed to. West Point at the time focused heavily on engineering, thanks to its superintendent, Brevet Major Sylvanus Thayer. Before Thayer had arrived at West Point, it was marred with drunkenness, disorder, and riots, but he transformed the academy into a prestigious institution. He introduced the famed cadet uniform, with grey coats, starched white trousers, and plumed black leather hats, with polished brass scales for the chin straps. When Lee arrived in June of 1825, there were roughly 200 cadets, who would be given an exam intended to weed out those who were idiots and misfits. Following that, the cadets who made it through the examination were paired with 3 other cadets who shared a tent. Together, the tent mates had to purchase a joint toilet, a looking glass, a washstand and a basin, pitcher, tin pail, broom, and a scrubbing brush. The quality of the food was often described as poor, yet Lee never complained about it. Wealthier cadets who snuck out of West Point would visit Gridley's Tavern to eat, drink, and smoke. Most who went out would be given a demerit, but Lee never received any demerits, accomplishing a feat few others achieved. The curriculum consisted heavily of mathematics and French, as mathematics was crucial for military officers of the era, whilst France was the only ally to the United States and most military textbooks were in French. The Marquis de Lafayette often visited West Point to inspect the cadets, and these visits inspired Lee, as Lafayette and his father Henry had fought together in the American Revolution, bringing 18th century heroes into evolving 19th century military tactics. Lee's daily regime at West Point started at 5:30 a.m. with the Reveille, following a full day of mathematics and French classes, along with hours of independent studies. The cadets finished their day with full dress drills, parade, and inspections. The cadets' day would officially end at 10 p.m., and whilst all cadets maintained a busy schedule, Lee made many friends during his time at West Point. One such friend was troublemaking third-year cadet Jefferson Davis, who was caught going off grounds to the local tavern to get drunk. He was only allowed to remain due to his previous good standing. When Lee's first year at West Point finished, he was 3rd in his class and achieved a rating of 285 1/4 out of 300 total points available. He was placed on a list with the other distinguished cadets, and Lee's status among the good and the great was odd for a man new to the academy. His reputation would earn him the nickname Marble Man for his emotionless expressions, whether he won or lost. During Lee's second year, drawing was included in the curriculum, as officers were expected to be able to draw a usable map. Lee was made a senior cadet and tutored many of his fellow cadets in mathematics. He was enamored by the campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte and read multiple books about his campaigns. Many of these books were new to the United States, showing the impressive collection West Point had. Also, Lee's ability to read French with relative ease allowed him access to these texts, as they would not have been translated into English. Many of Napoleon's tactics would be used by Lee on the battlefield, as, like Napoleon, he refused to fight on the defensive and preferred to use rapid attacks and bold flanking maneuvers. Following Lee's second year, he maintained second place standing in his class and applied for leave to visit his mother, who now lived with Lee's oldest brother, Charles Carter Lee, in Georgetown. His mother's health had greatly deteriorated since Lee went away to West Point, and when he came home, he took control of her care. Lee returned in 1827 for his third year at West Point and added physics and chemistry to his course list. Lee was introduced to battalion tactics and artillery use on the battlefield. He enhanced his knowledge by reading Machiavelli, Hamilton, Rousseau, and John Paul Jones. His wide command of different subjects outside of the military or engineering made him a special officer, though he remained in second place in his class. When Lee started his final year, he was given the position of Adjutant of the Corps, which is the highest position a cadet can hold. He would take his final exam on the 1st of June, 1828, finishing second once again, only to Charles Mason. Upon graduating, Lee was given his choice of commission as a lieutenant in the Engineer Corps, a prize worthy of a top student at West Point. Though his achievements while at West Point would bring joy to Lee for a time, another family hardship would hit him hard. Lee had just arrived home when it became clear his mother would not recover, and in a couple of weeks of his return home, Anne passed away. Following his mother's death, Lee spent much of his time in Arlington, Virginia, especially with Mary Anna Randolph Curtis. The two met during Lee's first furlough, and he made a good first impression whilst attending house parties in his grey cadet attire. Ironically, they were seen as a mismatched pairing, as Lee was never late and was overly organised, while Mary was almost always late and scatterbrained. Despite this, the two took their time with supervised visits and hoped eventually for a future together with the blessing of Mary's parents. On the 11th of August 1829, Lee received orders from Washington to report to Major Samuel Babcock of the Corps of Engineers in Cockspur Island, Georgia. Unfortunately for Lee, Cockspur Island was a depressing, hostile location with heat, humidity, fever, and mosquitoes, which made summer work
Boy, those four just sound delightful.
Unbearable. But it was also near where his father was buried. The Corps of Engineers had been attempting to build a fort to protect the mouth of the Savannah River, but was struggling to succeed. Lee immediately got to work, even getting involved in the labor himself, although most of his work would be destroyed by a storm after the labor season ended. Major Babcock would not return to Cockspur, as he was replaced with Lieutenant J.K.F. Mansfield. Mansfield lacked confidence to complete the project, and in turn would be replaced with Captain Delafield. Lee and Delafield immediately began outlining new plans for the fort, with Lee acting as the draftsman. Savannah would teach Lee a valuable lesson with regards to the sedated decision-making of the Corps of Engineers, and how projects lacked sufficient funds and were located in the worst places possible. He felt that if a situation was hopeless to change, you should remove yourself from the situation, and so Lee used his connections in Washington to get him reassigned to Old Point, Virginia, at Fort Monroe. Transferring to Fort Monroe would bring him closer to Mary, and his smart decision-making would set him apart from others. On his way to Fort Monroe, Lee stopped in Arlington to see Mary, and whilst there, he finally convinced her father to let them marry. Mary took Lee to the dining room to eat, and Lee asked Mary if she would marry him. The couple would marry on the 30th of June 1831, and Mary decided to share Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe. She did so, and they lived there completely on their own, without any support from her father. The two were quite unique, as Mary had a tendency to boss Lee around the house, something unusual in the era. Nonetheless, the two maintained a strong bond, and it was during this time that the Lees acquired a place in Arlington, a location which enabled him to put down roots, something he never had during his childhood. The Arlington House, as it would be later called, was heavily inspired by Lee's relative's house, Mount Vernon, or George Washington's plantation. The couple moved into Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe in August of 1831, but his ability to work would be affected by problems with the authority of the garrison, between the fort and school leader Brevet Colonel Eustace and the engineer leader Captain Andrew Talcott. Disputes rose frequently between the two men, mainly because the labourers for the engineering corps were disruptive to military procedures, which vexed Brevet Colonel Eustace. Despite the conflict between the army and the engineers, Lee excelled and took on vast amounts of responsibility, despite his inferior rank to many other officers. Lee worked hard to complete Fort Monroe, which would become known as the Gibraltar of Chesapeake Bay, and it was during this time at Fort Monroe that America's only effective slave revolt occurred in Southampton County, Virginia, which became known as the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was an educated slave who preached to other slaves about the evils of slavery and how one day God would release them from their chains, allowing them to enact their revenge against their owners. An eclipse gave Turner the sign he was looking for, and he started his rebellion on the 21st of August 1831. As a result of the rebellion, Fort Monroe received 3 companies of artillery to deter any further rebellions. This event would shock the South, as the myth of happy slaves was ultimately laid to rest. It also resulted in stricter laws regarding the freedom of slaves. Robert E. Lee was always consistent regarding his view on slavery and its effects on society. He was never an enthusiastic supporter, and in a letter to Mary, he stated that, quote, "Slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is..."
That's a great place to leave it. I'm going to stop it here, and we'll jump right back into it. I don't know if this is all going to be Lee and then it's Grant, or if it intertwines them together. I think that would be a good story. But I don't know. It sounds like it's going to be all Lee at first. But who cares? Because I don't know much about Robert E. Lee. So let's learn. All right, I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. Otherwise, I won't do part 2, which is a lie. I'm going to do part 2 immediately after this. All right. Have a good day. Have a good night.